Ruby didn't ask to visit the shelter. Her grandmother didn't plan a party. It was supposed to be just another quiet birthday, just like the last two. The girl in the pink dress spent her day drawing animals that didn't exist. Meanwhile, a dog named Sunny spent his lying in the corner of a kennel waiting for no one. 2 stories. 2 silences. Until their paths crossed and something small and sacred sparked a look, a whisper, and the beginning of something no one saw coming. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Late October in Willow Glen arrived with a slow hush of wind and the scent of wet leaves. The small town nestled by the edge of Pine Lake in Minnesota had already begun to quiet for winter. Trees stood like faded memories, bare and trembling in the wind, their amber crowns now scattered across the sidewalks. The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds the color of unspoken grief. On the outskirts of town, past the last grocery store and the tiny public library, stood the Willow Glen Animal Shelter, a low beige building with a chain-link fence that always seemed to sigh in the breeze. Inside, the shelter bustled with life, at least in the front rows. Puppies yipped and barked from clean metal kennels, their eager tails smacking against the walls. Volunteers walked past with leashes, treats, and smiles, but none of them walked all the way to the very back. Because there, in the last kennel before the maintenance closet, lay a dog no one noticed anymore. His name was Sunny. Sunny was a 10-year-old golden retriever, with thinning fur that had once gleamed like sunlight through honey. His muzzle had turned white, and his eyes had dulled from years of gentle service into something far away and quiet. Once, Sunny had been a therapy dog in a senior care home, visiting elderly patients with his slow, tender gaze and velvety ears. He had offered comfort without ever asking for it back. But when his owner, an elderly woman named Bernice, passed away from pneumonia the winter prior, her children surrendered Sunny to the shelter with a note. Too old, not good with kids. In truth, Sunny had never been anything but kind. He simply stopped trying. Each morning, when the lights flickered on and the smell of kibble filled the air, he remained curled up on his faded plaid blanket, tucked so far into the corner of his kennel that he seemed part of the wall itself. His food bowls were refilled, his water was changed, and sometimes someone offered him a treat through the bars. He never growled. He never moved. He was polite in his grief, obedient in his sadness. His ears never perked anymore, and his tail hadn't wagged in months. If he dreamed of a home that no longer existed. Meanwhile, across town in a quiet 2-story house on Mulberry Street, an 8-year-old girl named Ruby Ellen Prescott sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor. She wore her favorite pink corduroy dress, the one with the 2 little heart-shaped pockets and white leggings that had gone gray at the knees. Ruby was small for her age, with long, wispy auburn hair that always fell into her eyes, and a soft freckled face that rarely smiled outside the safety of her room. She lived with her grandmother, Sarah Prescott, a retired school librarian in her mid-60s. Sarah was a tall, thin woman with iron gray hair pulled tightly into a bun, and a voice that always sounded like it had once read too many bedtime stories and had grown tired of hearing no endings. Since losing her daughter and son-in-law in a car accident 3 years earlier, Sarah had hardened in small, invisible ways. She wasn't unkind, but she lived life like it might break if she looked at it too directly. She did her best, cooked healthy meals, ironed Ruby's school uniform, and left small, encouraging notes in lunchboxes. But her heart had retreated into structure and silence, and Ruby felt the distance like fog in her chest. Ruby didn't talk much at school. Her classmates found her strange. She carried a spiral notebook filled with drawings of animals, mostly dogs, and she often sat alone beneath the playground maple sketching while others laughed on the swings. Her favorite drawing, the one she kept redrawing over and over, was of a golden dog with big, gentle eyes and a collar shaped like a sunflower. She had named him Sunshine. In her mind, Sunshine never barked loudly, never demanded attention. He simply sat beside her, resting his head on her lap while the world passed them by. Ruby never told anyone, but she pretended Sunshine was real, that he was waiting somewhere, that maybe, just maybe, he had been waiting for her, too. On that particular Thursday afternoon, Ruby had come home with a crumpled flyer in her backpack, a class announcement for Pet Adoption Week at Willow Glen Shelter. She didn't say anything as she handed it to her grandmother at the kitchen table. Sarah looked over the paper, sighed, and said, "Ruby, we've talked about this. We can't have a dog. It's a lot of responsibility." Ruby only nodded, sliding onto the bench, opening her sketchbook again. Sarah watched her from across the table. She saw the drawing Sunshine again this time, sitting by a tree with Ruby's name written in the roots. Sarah folded the paper silently. She thought of Ruby's lonely lunches, of how she no longer asked for birthday parties, of how she sometimes whispered in her sleep, but she didn't say anything more. Ruby returned to her room as the wind picked up outside. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk like whispers, and the sky darkened into a moody charcoal. Inside, Ruby lay on her bed, with her sketchbook tracing lines around Sunshine's ears. Downstairs, Sarah sat by the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea, staring at nothing. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the evening. Saturday morning arrived with a pale sun climbing behind clouds that couldn't decide whether to rain or scatter. The wind whispered softly through the thinning maples outside the Prescott home, shaking loose a few final leaves that spiraled across the driveway. Inside the kitchen, the quiet clink of porcelain cups was the only sound as Sarah sipped her tea, glancing occasionally toward the staircase. She was already dressed as always in a long wool cardigan, and her house skirt a conservative olive green number she had worn for years. Her hair, tightly pinned in its usual no-nonsense bun, framed a face that had grown sharp over time. Not cruel, but carved by restraint. Sarah Prescott had always been a woman of schedules and quiet dignity. Even before tragedy took her daughter and son-in-law in a winter wreck on Highway 47, Sarah had been composed, cautious, unwilling to drift too far from the known. But afterward, that caution hardened. She didn't resent Ruby, not ever, but the presence of a child was a constant echo of the daughter she had lost, and that grief had turned into discipline, a love expressed through order. Today was different, though. A piece of paper on the refrigerator, Ruby's school flyer about Pet Adoption Week, still caught her eye. She hadn't thrown it away. That, in Sarah's world, was already a crack in the walls. At 9:15 a.m., a car horn honked from outside. Sarah didn't react immediately, but after a beat, she walked to the foot of the stairs and called Ruby. "She's here." From upstairs, Ruby appeared like a breath of color. Her pink dress had been ironed by herself. Her hair was still messy, tied into a crooked-side ponytail, and she wore her small canvas backpack with the drawing pad tucked inside. Ruby never liked being late, though she never said so out loud. She just moved quietly, as if afraid the moment might vanish if she made too much noise. Waiting outside the house was Sophie Kendall, Sarah's neighbor from 2 doors down. Sophie was in her late 30s with a thick auburn braid tossed over one shoulder and a soft warmth in her cheeks that made her seem perpetually caught mid-laugh, even when she wasn't smiling. She had been friends with Sarah's daughter once before the accident, and had since then taken up a quiet concern for Ruby. Sophie worked as a veterinary technician in a nearby town, and had recently married a teacher named Mark. They didn't have children of their own, but Sophie had a way with kids, gentle, never insistent, and always willing to wait for eye contact. "Good morning, Ruby," she said as the car door opened. Her voice was like mittens, warm and without edge. "Hi, Ruby," whispered, climbing into the passenger seat. "You ready to meet some noisy puppies?" Sophie teased, lightly, starting the car. Ruby gave a tiny nod but turned to look out the window. The drive to the Willow Glen Animal Shelter was short, just past the middle school and a shuttered feed store. The car was filled with soft music, but neither of them said much. Sophie glanced at Ruby occasionally, not to push, just to notice. She was good at noticing. When they arrived, the parking lot was already half full. A few families were unloading toddlers and snacks, and posters fluttered near the shelter entrance, "Adopt a Friend Today," with paw prints and smiling cartoon dogs. Inside, the front kennels were alive with motion. Puppies barked and bounced, tails wagging furiously against steel gates. Children squealed, mothers crouched, fathers held leashes, as if preparing for a battlefield. Sophie smiled at the chaos and guided Ruby through it. "Let me know if anyone stands out to you," Sophie said. Ruby stayed close, gripping her sketchbook tight against her chest. She glanced at the dogs but didn't reach out. So much barking, so many paws. They passed kennel after kennel. Chocolate labs, beagles, a hyper shepherd mix that tried to climb the bars. Ruby's shoulders tensed. It was too much, too loud, too eager. Sophie became momentarily distracted by a cluster of golden puppies wrestling in the corner, laughing as one tumbled over backwards with its oversized ears flapping. She didn't notice when Ruby slipped a few steps behind. That's when Ruby saw him. The kennel was tucked in the very last row beyond the mop sink and the folding chairs stacked against the wall. Here the shelter was quieter, like the sound had run out of breath. In the farthest cage lay a dog, unlike the others. No jumping, no barking, just a soft presence like a ghost resting in the shadows. Sonny, though she didn't yet know his name. He was curled tightly on a worn-out plaid blanket, his coat dulled to a tarnished gold. His ribs showed faintly through his side, and his tail, feathered but thin, lay motionless beside him. His eyes were half closed, watching nothing. Ruby stood in front of the kennel and slowly sat down, cross-legged. She didn't call out. She didn't tap the bars. She simply looked. After a moment, she pressed her cheek lightly against the cold metal. Sonny didn't move, but his nose did. Just the faintest twitch, a test of the air between them. He didn't lift his head, didn't open his eyes all the way, but he smelled her. And Ruby didn't need more than that. She whispered, "Hi." Behind her, Sophie was calling softly Ruby, but didn't sound alarmed. Ruby didn't answer. She tugged her dress gently under her knees and let the moment hold. The chaos of the other kennels, the sounds of adoption forms and cheerful leashes, all fell away in that quiet corner. It wasn't the kind of meeting people expected. No leaping into arms, no licking faces. Just one child sitting and one dog not turning away. Sonny shifted his paw an inch. That was enough. The air inside Willow Glen Animal Shelter held a certain stillness in the back rows, the kind that only existed where nothing stirred anymore. It smelled faintly of bleached dry kibble, and something older wool blankets, and dust perhaps. Sophie had finally wandered back toward Ruby after a few minutes with the golden puppies, her laughter now softened by the silence she found at the far end of the corridor. She paused as she caught sight of Ruby. The girl was still seated cross-legged in front of the final kennel dress, folded neatly beneath her knees, cheek resting lightly against the metal bars. Her eyes were open but soft-focused on the dog that had barely acknowledged her existence. Sophie didn't speak right away. There was something sacred about the stillness between Ruby and the dog. It didn't feel like absence. It felt like listening. Moments later, a quiet pair of footsteps approached. Dana Martinez, the shelter's assistant manager, rounded the corner, holding a clipboard and a cup of coffee gone cold. Dana was in her early 40s with frizzy black curls she tied into a puffed ponytail, and a light pink hoodie stained from breakfast burrito grease. Her face, though tired, was alert and kind in the way of people who had spent years reading animal body language more fluently than human tones. She glanced toward Ruby, then crouched beside Sophie, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's Sonny," she said, nodding toward the kennel. "He hasn't stood up in weeks." Sophie looked toward her. "He sniffed her," she said. "Just barely." Dana smiled with the quiet reverence of someone who had seen many dogs forgotten and only a few rediscovered. "That's more than he does most days." Sonny hadn't moved since Ruby sat down, save for that single twitch of his nose. But now, slowly, one of his front paws extended forward across the blanket. His ears didn't lift, his tail didn't wag, but there was a subtle change in posture, a slight uncoiling, as if he were remembering how bones and muscles worked or trying to believe it was worth the effort. Ruby didn't say anything. She simply watched. Her eyes didn't widen with hope, nor did she smile. She just stayed patiently present. Dana reached for the latch. "Would it be okay if we opened the gate?" Just to see Sophie glanced at Ruby, who gave the faintest nod. With care, Dana unhooked the latch and slowly opened the kennel door. It creaked slightly and Sonny blinked for the first time in minutes. His ears moved only a little, and he raised his head from his paw's neck stiff like it hadn't held weight in days. Ruby didn't reach toward him. She simply whispered, "You don't have to come out, Sonny. I just want to sit with you." The dog's head twitched as if hearing his name for the first time again. He didn't stand, but after what felt like an eternity, he shifted onto his elbows. Then, with shaking effort, he pushed himself up. His back legs slipped slightly weak from disuse, but he managed to steady them. His tail, though still no longer, lay limp against the floor. Dana pressed a hand to her chest. "He's standing," Sophie breathed. Ruby said nothing. She just stared as if afraid words might undo him. Slowly, one trembling paw stepped forward, then another. Sonny crossed the edge of the kennel door and took a single step out into the hallway. That was all. He didn't run or bark or lick anyone's face, but to the three people witnessing it, it might as well have been a miracle. Ruby stood too slowly not to approach him, but to walk beside him. "We'll go slow," she whispered. "It's okay." Sonny wobbled slightly and looked toward her. Then he took another step, and another. By the time they reached the empty bench at the end of the hallway, he had walked nearly 10 feet, his first steps outside the kennel in almost a month. He sat down beside Ruby, not touching her but close. She folded her arms in her lap and looked straight ahead, eyes blinking slowly, as if she and the dog were watching something only they could see. Sophie leaned back against the wall and let herself smile. Dana crouched to make a quick note on her clipboard, but didn't move too close. "You can sit as long as you want," she said softly. "We won't disturb him." Across town, the wind stirred yellow leaves along Mulberry Street. Inside the Prescott house, Sarah sat in her sewing nook upstairs. The tiny room smelled faintly of cedar and lavender sachets filled with bolts of fabric, old thread spools, and a small radio that played soft jazz she barely noticed anymore. On her lap lay a piece of soft rose-colored fabric cut precisely and neatly basted. Her fingers worked with silent precision, threading pink embroidery floss through the collar hem. She had been sewing for over an hour now, not for anyone in particular, not for a party, not for an occasion, but for Ruby. The dress was simple, lined in soft cotton with delicate pleats along the skirt and small mother-of-pearl buttons sewn with steady, practiced hands. Sarah hadn't made clothes in years. She used to sew dresses for her daughter when she was little, before everything turned into silence and casserole dishes from neighbors. But something had moved her this morning, something she couldn't name. Perhaps it was the way Ruby had looked the night before, sketching quietly with her legs pulled up to her chest. Or maybe it was the sound of Sophie's car driving away that morning, and the weight of the empty house that followed. She didn't expect Ruby to wear the dress. Children didn't often want things they didn't ask for, but Sarah needed to make it all the same. She needed her hands to do something kind, even if her voice hadn't figured out how to follow yet. In the corner of the sewing nook stood a small framed photograph, one taken 12 years ago. A younger Sarah smiled gently with her daughter Elise, both of them holding a baby wrapped in pink cloth Ruby, only weeks old. That smile, long ago, looked softer than anything Sarah could remember feeling lately. She lowered her needle, looked out the window and wondered what kind of birthday Ruby might have this year. Probably a quiet one again. Back at the shelter, Sonny lowered his body slowly beside Ruby's legs. She didn't touch him, but her hand rested palm down beside his paw. It didn't take contact to mean something. It only took nearness. The car ride home was quiet, not out of discomfort, but something more fragile, like everyone was afraid to breathe too loudly and ruin whatever had just started to heal. Sonny lay curled in the back seat of Sophie's Subaru, his head resting on an old fleece blanket, the corners frayed from years of laundry cycles. His eyes were open, but only half. He didn't sleep. He simply watched the passing trees through the window as if trying to memorize them, or, perhaps, unsure if they were even real. In the front seat, Ruby sat with her knees drawn up, hands folded tightly over her sketchbook, her pink dress slightly wrinkled now from sitting on the cold kennel floor. Her eyes flicked back every so often just to make sure he was still there, still breathing. She hadn't said a word since they left the shelter, but Sophie didn't push. She knew better than to disturb a sacred silence. Sophie's hands gripped the steering wheel with quiet precision. She wasn't a nervous driver, but today she was careful, like she was carrying something breakable in more than just the back seat. She glanced into the rearview mirror once every block, not for traffic, but for Sonny. Sophie had never imagined herself in this role. Growing up, she was the youngest of 5, the one always being told to go play or stay out of the way. She wasn't maternal, not in the way people described it. She had always loved animals, though, worked with them, nursed them, watched them trust again after unthinkable hurt. But people-children, that was new terrain, and Ruby was not just a child. She was a quiet wound, still learning not to flinch when kindness came too close. The house Sarah Prescott lived in sat on a quiet, tree-lined street where every mailbox looked hand-painted and every porch held at least one flower pot. Sophie parked by the curb and turned the engine off, but Ruby made no move to open her door. "Would you like help getting him inside?" Sophie asked gently. Ruby nodded once and they both moved in tandem. Sophie opened the rear door first, crouching low. "Hey, Sonny," she whispered. "We're home. Or, close enough." Sonny didn't respond immediately, but he lifted his head. Sophie placed a hand just under his chest, offering gentle support as he pushed himself upright. His legs trembled slightly but held. Ruby opened the front door of the house, stepping aside like a quiet doorkeeper. Inside, the living room felt warmer than usual, not from temperature but from the faint hum of something newly alive. A small bed had already been placed beside the fireplace, simple but soft, with a yellow blanket folded neatly on top. A silver water bowl sat near the hearth. Sophie had asked Sarah for permission ahead of time to prepare the space. To her surprise, the older woman hadn't objected, just nodded once and said, "Keep it clean." Sonny stepped inside, slowly paused, tapping on the hardwood floor, his head turning left and right like a visitor entering a dream. He stopped beside the dog bed and stood there unsure. "You can lay down," Ruby whispered. He did. Ruby knelt beside him, pulling her sketchbook into her lap. She flipped through the pages, stopping at the one she'd drawn the most, the golden dog with the sunflower collar. She turned it toward him. "This is Sunshine," she said. "He's brave. He protects the other animals in the forest. He doesn't talk much, but everyone listens when he looks at them. Sunny didn't react, but his breathing slowed. Ruby continued page after page. There was a raccoon named Pebble, who wore glasses and read maps. A blue jay named Mana, who carried tiny letters between trees. A fox named Clive, who played harmonica. She had names for each of them, and stories too. Adventures, rescues, quiet nights under stars. She didn't expect Sunny to understand, but she told him anyway. Upstairs, Sarah stood at the landing looking down between the railings. She hadn't come to the door when they arrived. She hadn't helped carry the supplies, but she'd been watching and listening. In her hand, still unfinished, was the pink dress she had started sewing. She ran her fingers along the collar, pausing over a stitch that had pulled too tight. Sarah Prescott was not a woman who cried easily. Even at the funeral, she'd held herself upright, accepting casseroles and condolences with a nod and a thank you. But today, seeing her granddaughter speaking softly to a dog who had forgotten how to listen, something inside her shifted. She didn't cry, but she sat on the edge of the bed and closed her eyes. Sophie didn't stay long. She helped fill Sunny's water bowl and gave Ruby a soft pat on the shoulder. "I'll check in tomorrow, okay?" Ruby nodded. "Thank you for today. You don't have to thank me. He picked you, remember?" That night, Ruby slept on the couch beside Sunny. She hadn't planned to, but when Sarah came down hours later to check the locks, she found her granddaughter curled in a blanket, head resting against a pillow, her hand trailing from the cushion to the edge of the dog bed, where Sunny's paw rested beside it. Sarah stood for a long moment before turning off the light and retreating back upstairs. The morning of Ruby's 9th birthday arrived without ribbons or candles. The sky over Willow Glen was overcast again with faint streaks of sunlight, pushing through thick clouds like fingers searching for something. It had rained the night before, and the backyard grass still held droplets that shimmered beneath the fence. The house was unusually quiet, and Ruby, still in her pajamas, sat curled on the edge of the couch watching Sunny stretch his long body near the fireplace. Sunny had been in the Prescott home for just under 2 weeks, and every day brought something new. A slightly longer walk down the hallway, a faint tail wag when Ruby came into the room. But it was his eyes that had changed the most. Where once there had been only haze and caution, now there was recognition, and sometimes, if the light was right, a flicker of something close to trust. Ruby hadn't mentioned her birthday to anyone. She didn't expect much. The last 2 birthdays had passed quietly, just her and Sarah, and a small vanilla cupcake on a china plate, the candle lit more for ritual than celebration. Her classmates never came. Invitations got folded or lost, and the ones who received them simply smiled politely and made excuses. Ruby never asked twice. Sarah, however, remembered. She always remembered. The morning had started like any other. The smell of eggs drifted from the kitchen, and Sarah, tall and sharply built, as ever moved about in her robe hair, still pinned into its habitual twist. But something about her movements felt different, more deliberate. She set the table with actual napkins. She had even placed a tiny yellow flower from the backyard in a glass next to Ruby's plate. That alone made the girl blink twice. Breakfast was quiet but warm. Sarah didn't say happy birthday until Ruby was almost done eating. When she did, it was soft, almost like testing the air. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." Ruby looked up. She didn't smile, not right away, but her voice was steady when she said, "Thanks, Grandma." Later that morning, Sarah told Ruby she should get dressed, that there might be a surprise or two that afternoon. Ruby didn't ask what that meant. She just went upstairs and pulled on her new pink dress, the one Sarah had sewn without explanation. It fit perfectly. She tied her hair into a loose ponytail and pressed a small sunflower clip to the side. Then she came downstairs and sat beside Sunny, waiting. By noon, Sarah had quietly begun setting up the backyard. She didn't decorate in balloons or hang banners. That wasn't Ruby's way, but she did carry out a folding table with paper cups and apple juice, set out a plate of oatmeal cookies, and placed a small wrapped box on the edge of the bench. Then she went inside and made a few phone calls. The first to arrive was Mr. Llewellyn, the elderly widower who lived next door. He was in his 70s, always wore suspenders over his flannel shirts, and had a voice like gravel soaked in honey. He came with a mason jar of honey from his backyard beehives and a folded piece of watercolor paper tucked under his arm. Then came Mrs. Patel from the corner house, the retired art teacher with a passion for birds and scarves in bold floral prints. She brought a tray of almond cookies and a little wind chime she had made from old teacups. Lastly, just as the wind shifted and the clouds thinned, came a young boy named Caleb, perhaps 10 years old, with round glasses too large for his face and a shy, apologetic smile. He had just moved in with his mother 3 houses down. Sarah had invited them in passing, but only Caleb came. Sonny watched them all from the threshold of the back door. He stood slowly as if weighing each step. His legs still trembled now and then, but he didn't falter. When Ruby stepped outside and sat on the edge of the porch, Sonny followed. He didn't bark, he didn't wag, but one by one he walked to each guest. To Mr. Llewellyn he pressed his nose gently to the man's hand and sat beside him for a full minute unmoving. To Mrs. Patel he leaned against her shawl-draped knee and blinked slowly. To Caleb he stopped, tilted his head, and after a moment rested his chin on the boy's shoe. Caleb smiled, awkward, unsure, and reached into his pocket. "I made this," he said quietly, handing Ruby a small folded piece of paper. Ruby opened it slowly. Inside was a sketch, rough and clearly drawn in pencil, but it showed Sonny lying beside a girl in a pink dress. The lines weren't perfect, but the intent was. There were stars in the sky, and the girl was smiling. "Your dog is beautiful," Caleb said. Ruby didn't speak right away. Then she looked down at Sonny and whispered, "Thank you." It was the first time she'd smiled in months. Not just the shadow of a smile. A real one, small, lopsided, but utterly hers. The sun broke through at last, dappling the grass with gold. Later, as the guests slowly left and the juice cups were emptied, Ruby sat on the porch with Sonny's head resting on her lap. She traced circles in his fur and whispered something only he could hear. "You saw me first. Now I'll see the others." Sarah, watching from the window, didn't interrupt. She just folded the spare napkins and returned to the sewing room to hang up the pattern from the pink dress, her heart heavy but softer than it had been in a long time. Sometimes the smallest act of being seen can change everything. Sonny was not the fastest, the youngest, or the most playful dog, but he carried a quiet light inside him waiting for someone to notice. And Ruby, in her stillness, offered that gift. What began as a silent moment between a forgotten dog and a lonely girl became a reminder of something far greater, a quiet miracle, the kind only God can plant in ordinary places. This story is a gentle whisper that God doesn't always work through thunder or grand signs. Sometimes he moves through a soft gaze, a trembling step, or the courage to stay beside someone who can't speak their pain. In a world that rushes to notice what shines the brightest, let us remember to pause and see the ones who wait in silence. Maybe you know someone who feels like Sonny. Maybe you felt like Ruby. Or maybe you're the one who needs to believe again that healing is possible. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little reminder that love still lives in quiet places. Comment Amen below if you believe in second chances and little miracles, and in the silent ways God brings us together. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that may just bring a little more hope into your day. And may God bless you and those you love with peace, with patience, and with the kind of love that never rushes but always finds its way. Amen.